So I have a few more things that I want to do. The next big thing I'm going to be doing is the Broad Street Pump, which is an extra history series. It's 4 episodes. We're going to blast through it. And I think that's going to be a lot of fun. I don't see any reason why I shouldn't just jump straight into it. So I'm pulling that up here. So I don't know what this is. So forever ago, I did a poll on the community tab to determine like the next several extra history series that I would do. So whoever got the most votes would come first, and whoever got the second most would go after that. And I've just been going down that list. And I think this was like second from the bottom. So I don't know how actually popular this one is. What it's about, it's called, the first episode is You Know Nothing, Jon Snow, which that must be a Game of Thrones reference. I've not actually seen Game of Thrones. Well, I watched a good amount of the first season, and I never continued it from there, though I'm not opposed to checking it out, just never got around to it. I was too busy watching anime. So yeah, that should be cool. With no idea what we are getting into here, I suppose I can only just get started and we'll run through these and see if there's anything I can learn from this. Almost certainly I will, because I have no idea what a Broad Street Pump is. It sounds like a dance, so let's do it. Or like some sort of a financial scheme. A dance or a financial scheme. That's my guess. Let's get started.
Noxious vapors that cause disease are known as miasma. The miasma spreads through the air, and as it is breathed in, the human being becomes possessed of sickness.
I'm not sure that's how it works.
You know nothing, Jon Snow.
Oh, so wait, this is like a medical science thing. Oh, that's perfect. I really like that. I wonder why I didn't know about this earlier. I've been hearing so much about like medical history and stuff because it's a very popular subject for obvious reasons right now. People are just cranking out books on medical history and all that. So cool.
Jon Snow, yes, really, was no lord's son. He was born to a coal yard worker in one of the poorest neighborhoods of York. It was 1813. Napoleon had just retreated from Russia, and the Industrial Revolution in England was in full swing. Young Snow's mind outpaced his setting. He was a perspicacious youth, always curious and inquisitive, always digging into whatever he found. His mother noticed her child's perpetually active mind and swore to herself that he would be no coal hand. She took a small inheritance that she had come into and paid to send him to school. He took to schooling like nothing else. By the time he was 14, he was apprenticed to a doctor in Newcastle, and it was here that he would first meet the specter that would haunt the rest of his life: cholera. You see, cholera had its roots in India, but with the increase in trade and transport in the 19th century, it crept its way up to Russia, then crawled westward through Europe, first making its way to London and then to Newcastle in 1831. But so many were struck so fast by the disease that the doctor who Snow was apprenticed to was overloaded. And so it was at the age of 18 that Jon Snow was sent alone into the horror of the coal slums to treat the coal workers dying of this disease. God. And make no mistake, cholera is one of the most terrifying diseases out there. It doesn't cause the unimaginable mortality rate of the plague, smallpox, or even some strains of influenza.
Doesn't it have like more long-term effects? I thought that was the problem.
But it's a horrific disease to contract. A disease whose horror is in how it manifests, how it takes over a person's body. It is swift and utterly wretched. Cholera can take a healthy person and leave them a husk overnight. And its onset is sudden. A person can be walking down the street, and then all of a sudden they'll grab their stomach and fall to the ground, spewing vomit and diarrhea. They'll continue to expel diarrhea at up to 20 liters a day until their skin becomes turgid and their blood turns to sludge, becoming too dehydrated and thick to circulate due to how much fluid the person's lost. Then the organs shut down one by one, and the person dies not directly because of an action of the disease, but because they've lost so much fluid that their body can no longer form the plasma it needs to keep itself alive. And all the things
no.
Jon Snow had learned as an apprentice achieved nothing. From house to house he'd walk, trying to apply every technique known to medicine at the time to treat the sick. Bleeding, opium, strong herb.
Bleeding. Oh gosh. Bloodletting was a very common practice before we actually really understood how germs and diseases and all that stuff worked. So you just like cut into somebody and just pour blood out of their wounds and hope that the disease comes out with it. And that's something that I've read a good amount of during like the smallpox epidemics and the early United States and stuff like that. There was a lot of hullabaloo about bloodletting. It's absolutely terrible.
To keep off the miasma.
I am going to be doing this whole series in one shot. We're just running through it.
All of these things had no effect, and patient after patient died. Even when he tried giving them water, no matter how much water he gave them, they'd appear better for a few short hours. Then they would soon sink back down to torpor, and finally, death.
With this, bloodletting would probably be like the worst thing you can do. Yeah, you don't want, Michael Hill has already pointed it out. Yeah, like bleeding right now, like if your issue is hydration, you don't want to cut out more fluids from a person. That's awful.
So, despite his training, one by one as he made his rounds, he left his patients' blue-pale corpses behind. His idea to rehydrate them was correct, but the medical community was only just beginning to understand that the excessive diarrhea not only caused a loss of water, but a loss of sodium as well, which is a key component of blood plasma.
Drink
and it
salt
wouldn't be
water.
until the 20th century that the major breakthrough was made, when it was discovered that drinking glucose would help a cholera-ravaged intestinal system take up the saline it so desperately needed. And so Jon Snow's patients died. But as an apprentice, he'd kept meticulous journals with his observations and theories. He had seen that coal workers would often be struck down by cholera deep in the coal pits, far from the graveyards, swamps, or sewage pools that the infectious miasma was thought to seep from. So he hypothesized that there must be something else going on. He didn't know exactly what, but he tried to express to local doctors that rather than miasma, there was something that could persist in water and be transmitted from person to person that caused disease. And they all told him, "You know nothing."
So we don't know germ theory yet. So this is insane to us. But like, we kind of take it for granted that we kind of understand what germs are. We have a very like modern understanding of how germs are. And you know, with this last year, everybody became a medical expert. Like, we have a very sophisticated understanding of medical science and stuff, but we kind of take that for granted because, like, it's really new. In the grand scheme of, like, human existence, we went so long not understanding how any of this stuff worked.
Jon Snow. And so, as the cholera epidemic
Headphone
eventually
keeps almost
passed
falling
as
out.
mysteriously as it had come, Jon Snow moved on to other work. He bounced between apprenticing for a few other doctors, until in 1836 he went to London to begin his formal education in medicine. And he was a man who loved education. In 1 year he completed the schooling necessary to get a license as a general practitioner. Then he got his apothecary's license. Then he received a bachelor's and a doctorate in medicine, which apparently wasn't a requirement for practicing medicine at the time. And
Dude, I want
finally,
one of
he
those.
qualified to join the Royal College of Surgeons, which is about as rad a doctor thing as you could do in those days. During this period, John began doing serious study on anesthesia. You see, before Snow, most doctors of the day would just pour some chloroform on a rag and toss it over their patient's face. Nighty-night, see you in a few hours, if you're lucky. But Snow began to scientifically test dosages and assess what mixtures at what times were the most effective. His work revolutionized anesthesiology. In fact, his work was so acclaimed, he even twice anesthetized the Queen herself. And the medical community finally said, "You know something, Jon Snow." But he had never...
So I assume this "you know nothing, Jon Snow" is the Game of Thrones reference coming into this, and not history going into Game of Thrones, because I'm pretty sure that's a thing they say in Game of Thrones. But this is just them like doing a running Game of Thrones gag, right? I like I said, haven't seen enough of the show. Hardly saw any of Jon Snow.
forgotten cholera, that specter that had been burned into him in his youth. And in 1848, when John was 35, cholera returned to haunt London. This time, he was determined not to let it win. He knew cholera wasn't
Get him,
just the
John.
result of bad air, and he was determined to prove it. He reached out to all of his connections in the medical community and tracked down the first case of the new outbreak, a sailor named John Harnold. He had a lead. He went and immediately talked to the physician who treated Mr. Harnold, only to find out that he had treated another man in the exact same room Mr. Harnold rented 8 days after Mr. Harnold died. The case was afoot. John suspected
This is some
contagion,
detective work
perhaps
right here.
from soiled bed linens that had gone unwashed after the first death. Not miasma from some poison floating in the air. No, this disease was transferred from one man to another. He was sure of it. He just needed...
I remember, I think Ben Franklin was like super afraid of like some form of miasma or something like that. I believe he had like a habit of sleeping with the window open because of his fear of like, I guess, infected air or like dirty air or whatever that is. He wanted like the air circulation. There was a night he had to share a bed with John Adams, and they had like a famous argument over the health benefits of having your window open at night.
needed proof. Cases began to pop up all over London, and he raced from one lead to the next, interviewing patients and physicians to see if he could draw the link. He was told by one person after another that the pain started in their intestines, which led him to believe that the disease must be caused by something they ingested rather than something they inhaled. Otherwise, wouldn't the disease start in the nose or the throat or the lungs? So, obviously not all of his reasoning was perfect, but it did lead him down the right path in this case. He theorized that the diarrhea caused by cholera might not only be a symptom, but also how the disease was spread. Now, because the term germs was frowned upon by many in the medical profession at the time, he started writing about how cholera was caused by a self-multiplying poison found in the water contaminated by fecal matter. He did a case study. He found a street where, on one side, all the waste poured out by the residents flowed toward the well they got their drinking water from, whereas on the other side, the waste flowed away from their well. He surveyed all those living on either side of the street. On the side where the well water mixed with the sewage, almost all of the inhabitants were laid low. On the other side of the street, only one person succumbed.
Oh, I know this story. Oh my god. Like, I actually know this story. It took me this long to I think it was a Jay Foreman video. I didn't realize we were talking about the same thing. It's the well. That brought it up. Okay, this is it. Okay, I'm starting to understand.
To cholera. He had it. He had his proof. He wrote furiously, detailing it all out, and then raced to the presses. He'd done it. His pamphlet circulated the city. The most learned minds of the day heard what he'd discovered, and they said, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." Join us next time as Jon Snow goes full statistical Sherlock Holmes to show that cholera is spread through the water, and invents the science of epidemiology in the process.
That's dope. Okay, let me just pull up the next one real quick. I mean, there's no reason to wait too much in between. Yeah, that moment they bring the well in, I'm pretty sure this is the same story as a Jay Foreman video that I've seen. Oh, hello, Cryopenis. How are you? My family's doing great. Sorry, talking to the chat. For those watching the VOD later. Family's wonderful. You know, visited them for Thanksgiving. It was cool. We're going to be doing episode 2 right now. So there's 4, I believe. Plus there's the Lies episode, but I'm going to watch that later when I'm not on stream. Yeah, so no reason to really wait too much on this, so let's just get into it.
Last we left Jon Snow, he had failed to convince the leading scientific minds of his time that cholera was transmitted through fluid rather than through a miasma in the air. But he was far from done. In 1850, he became one of the founding members of the Epidemiological Society of London. This was
So people don't start really embracing this stuff. I know it's not until after the American Civil War, because people always talk about the impacts and deaths of the war, and how, like in a lot of wars, more people died from like disease than anything, really. Like disease and infection and those problems and these things. If only we understood how the human body worked a little bit better, it would be so much. It would be so much better, and they would have so many more people would have survived. And I know that is like a huge conversation around the death toll. So we're still in 1850. We're not fully embracing this for a little bit. Even if he gets it through, it's going to take a while for it to be like normalized.
It was one of the first scientific medical societies to explicitly look not only for a cure to a disease or a way to treat its symptoms, but also to study the disease itself. How is it transmitted? How does it propagate? What environmental factors cause the disease to break out? In understanding these things, they could help not only to cure a disease, but also to contain it, or perhaps even prevent it from happening in the first place. So when
sick.
cholera once again returned to London in
Lol.
1854, Jon Snow planned to use all the tools his prodigious powers of logic availed him of to finally and definitively show that this disease, which he had fought all of his life, could be contained simply by keeping people away from contaminated water. But when the cholera outbreak of 1854 struck London, it appeared to follow no rhyme or reason. It was a primal force. It struck all over the city, and it struck across the class divide. So many in London, perhaps everybody in London except Jon Snow.
Because they were using the same water source. Oh my gosh, it all makes so much sense.
Snow thought it to be random. Some trick of the Constitution or some predisposition caused those who fell ill to fall ill, and those who didn't to stay well. It had to be an act of fate, or just dumb luck. But Snow had a hypothesis, and he planned to test it in one of the grandest statistical experiments done to that day. You see, he had his theory, the theory that cholera was transmitted through water, but even though he'd proven it to his satisfaction with his previous experiment regarding houses on opposite sides of the street, he knew he'd need further proof to convince the medical world. So he began to look. He needed commonalities. He needed something to link the seemingly random spread of the disease with water. Then, while going through municipal records, he found it. Eureka! There it was, just sitting in the books in front of him, staring him in the face. The district he worked in had its water supplied by two water companies, the Southwark and Vauxhall Water Company and the Lambeth Water Company. Both of them drew their water from the Thames River, but S&V and Lambeth had one key dissimilarity that would make all the difference in the world. One that may have been costing thousands of lives, but one we could barely conceive of today. You see, at the time, London not only had cesspools below houses and household waste running through the streets, but also a sewer system that flushed all of this waste to the nearest source of running water, the Thames. All of the city's sewage was pumped right into the river running through the middle of the city, the river where most of its occupants got their drinking water from. In a few years' time, this would get so bad that the smell of the river would be unceremoniously labeled the Great Stink. Which leads us right back to the difference between Southwark and Vauxhall and Lambeth. What was it that Jon Snow saw right there in those books that caused his eureka moment? Well, S&V was getting their water from downstream of where the sewage emptied into the Thames, while Lambeth had recently moved their facilities above the sewage outflows. He had the perfect case study, the perfect A/B test. If he was right about the mode of communication of cholera, all he'd have to do is compare the infection rate from those served by S&V to those served by Lambeth. He wrote, "People of both sexes, of every age and occupation, and of every rank and station, from gentlefolks down to the very poor, were divided into two groups without their choice, and in most cases without their knowledge. One group being supplied with water containing the sewage of London, and amongst it whatever might have come from the cholera patients. The other group having water quite free from such impurity." So, Snow began to canvass two of London's districts that had recently been hit hard by the epidemic. At first he thought it would be simple. He would go door to door, asking if anybody at that residence had been afflicted, and what water company they used. Simple. But nothing's ever that simple. Most residents didn't know what company they used. They were just tenants. They hadn't contracted the water for their place. What could he do?
So he's got to speak to
the landlords would know. Yeah. Armed with this thought, he traced the tenants back to their landlords, then used official documents to trace the landlords back to their homes scattered throughout London. He madly dashed about the city, knocking on doors, standing in the hallways of the rich and powerful, asking mad questions about water companies and properties they didn't even remember they owned. He was closer, but he needed more. What about the water itself? Could the water tell him where it came from? Perhaps now he was a madman, possessed of his errand, trying to make water talk. But talk it did. He ran a chemical analysis on water samples from each of the companies and found that S&V water contained 4 times as much salt as the water from Lambeth. He
Oh,
raced back
jeez.
to all the houses whose water source he couldn't yet ascertain, and, surely seeming mad, asked them for a thimbleful of water, which he then put in a test tube and brought back to his lab. And
That's
with
hilarious.
that, he had it. His records were complete. 38 of the 44 deaths that had occurred in that month had come from the S&V water. You were
And the Lambeth ones, like, they could have contracted it by other means from just, like, drinking the water directly. There are probably plenty of ways that the people under Lambeth could have also contracted it. But, like, with the overwhelming majority being from the Southwark one, like, okay, yeah. That's pretty damning right there.
933% more likely to die just by having the wrong water company pipe water to your house. There it was. That was the answer. And that's what he would have found out if he had just had a few more weeks to analyze his samples and tabulate his data. But
Oh,
he
does
was
he
a
die?
doctor, and his old foe wasn't going to let him rest that easily. Cholera struck again. At first it was a rumor, then a few isolated cases he might be able to ignore. Then on Tuesday morning, the 4th of September, he opened the paper and read these words. In Broad Street, on Monday evening, when the hearses came round to remove the dead, the coffins were so numerous that they were put on top of the hearses as well as the inside. Such a spectacle has
upsetting.
not been witnessed in London since the time of the plague. He was needed in a place called Broad Street.
I'm just kicking myself at this point that I didn't know what this story was from before. I don't know. I don't. It's such a good story, and I knew I'd heard it not just once before, but probably even more than that. Like this, I believe this is a story that's come back to me a few times, not just on video. So like the fact this is going into it from like it. I think in more detail than I was told. I think I was told like the big version of the story. This is giving more details and like creating more of a face for Jon Snow here. Like he's just some guy in other versions of the story that I found, and I feel like I'm getting to know more of like who he was as a person and how he interacted with this. While before I was just getting like how he just generally interacted with it. All right. All right, let's do it. Halfway there, living on a prayer.
A cholera outbreak had
So I think, hold on, this one is number 3. The next one I think is, I think that one's an epilogue. So it is an extension of this, but it's not considered part 4, but it is. So that is maybe worth pointing out. Which extra credit series am I going to be watching in the next series? I can actually probably check that for you. While I have all of y'all's attention, I will see if I have the poll saved right here. I'd have to scroll pretty far back in my community tab to get to it, so I would like to see if I have it screenshotted in my photos for you peoples. Maybe I don't have it. Oh, that would be unfortunate if I don't. I'm gonna go back just a little further. If I don't find it soon, then I'm giving up. And you're just gonna have to see when I take the time to go all the way back through the community tab. Or you can go all the way back in the community tab and find it before I do. Not finding it. Yeah, it does not. Oh, here it is. I found it. Here it is. So the poll had 5 different ones on it. So the first one was Justinian. We did that. The Zulu Empire. We did that. Early Christian schisms. We did that on a previous stream. We're doing Broad Street Pump now. And we have one more. It was Simón Bolívar. That's the one we're doing next. That one, at the time I screenshotted this, was tied with the Broad Street Pump. But I believe when I was checking again, Broad Street Pump pulled ahead by like 1%. So that's why we're doing Simón Bolívar next. Dodgemation's got to it. But I got to it like a second before I could see yours. So, because there's a little bit of latency here. So, it should be fun.
A cholera outbreak had struck Broad Street. The death count mounted, and the moans of the sick could be heard through thin tenement walls. It was down this street that Jon Snow walked, knocking on door after door after door. But many had already fled, and the cold blue end of cholera had claimed many of those who had not. Again, Jon Snow was frustrated in getting the evidence he sought, but this time the clock was ticking. Every passing minute meant more deaths, and every passing minute decreased his chances of preventing this from ever happening again. And so, by noon on Tuesday, the 4th of September, 1854, he realized that there'd be only one place he could quickly and efficiently get the data he so desperately needed: the office of the Registrar General. He raced from Broad Street to the halls of the government, demanding that some noxious stench...
Sorry, I dropped my drink. Hold on. Oh God, why did I do that? Oh no. Here we go. I just wanted to pull up my controls so that I'd be able to monitor my audio, and I caused problems.
hung
Back to what I
around
was
the
doing.
region
About 10
more
seconds, I
likely
got
to
distracted.
die. But he had been down this road before. He knew this wouldn't be enough to convince the miasmatists. They would just say that some noxious stench hung around the region of the pump and that the pump itself was coincidental. Nope, he needed something more. So he pored over his map. There were a few outliers. There, right there, on Cross Street, there was a clump of deaths that were closer to the Little Marlborough pump than the one on Broad Street. He raced to the tenement to see if he could get some answers, but he was too late. Those had only been the first deaths marked down in the Registrar General's morning notes. By afternoon, the entire family had been wiped out. Of all the 84 deaths he had on record, only 8 more were outside the area he'd marked as closest to the Broad Street pump. He needed to follow those leads. 3 were tragically children who went to school near Broad Street and would drink from the well on their way to and from their education. 3 more were workers who also regularly stopped at the well. The last 2 he couldn't get data for. This still left him with clear connections to the pump even for those who were outside its range, and equally importantly, outside the range of any argument about a miasmatic cloud. But he needed to understand the other holes in his data as well. On Poland Street, there was a massive workhouse with 535 inhabitants, and yet almost no one there had died, and it was well within the range of the Broad Street pump.
Oh, did I skip something? Sorry, that must have happened when I... Did it? My bad. That must have happened when I dropped my thing. Hold on. Let me go back, because I'm being told I might have skipped something.
One the cholera had taken. And so he began to establish a pattern of how these things were done. On-ground inspection combined with combing government records to get the data needed, not just to treat the disease, but to fight it. And fight it he would, right there on Broad Street. He returned to the epicenter with its air of suffering and death so that he could understand what those addresses he now held meant. His boot heels rang out against the pavers of the abandoned streets as he paced from house to house, trying to see the connection. Then he had it, of course. He needed to think of these deaths as a map. And so he began to craft his map, plotting the deaths
and that's why it was
by
a
one.
Mapman video.
And as his map filled out with tragedy, a pattern began to emerge. It really was map by proximity to wells, and you saw a pattern in where the most deaths occurred. You'd be able to tell if there was a contaminated well.
Going back to where I was.
Clear down in the Registrar General's morning notes. By afternoon, the entire family had been wiped out. Of all the 80 who were equally with range of the Broad Street pump, there should be 10 times as many deaths there at least. He rushed to the workhouse, feeling the daylight burning as each precious minute slipped away. He had to hurry. Upon questioning the workhouse director, the answer became glaringly obvious. The workhouse had its own private water supply.
Ooh.
Of course. Snow pressed the director further. Where do you get your water from? And the director replied, Grand Junction Waterworks. Snow already knew that Grand Junction water was safe based on his earlier research. It was all starting to make sense. Next, he had to go to the local brewery. There, they told him, teetotaler that he was, that their men drank nothing but beer. All the pieces fit.
Okay.
He had his case. Now he just had to convince the local health board to shut down the well. Now this had all happened within the first 48 hours of Snow's finding out about the outbreak. For 48 hours he had trudged through the streets that others had fled. He'd visited the sick, he'd recorded the statements of the bereaved. For 48 hours he had mapped, made statistical plots, studied and chased down data. And now, on Thursday night, after a brief rest, he prepared for what might be an even greater challenge, the meeting of the local health commission. He addressed them with all of the vigor and certainty of his data. He showed them his maps and his charts. He let them know the egregious mortality rate of those who had drunk from the well, and the remarkable clemency granted to those who had not. And in the end, after much deliberation, they said, you might know something, Jon Snow. And they agreed to remove the handle from the pump the following morning. Now, whether or not the outbreak would have burned itself out over the next few days on its own is up for debate, but what is certain is that by Monday, the epidemic had practically passed. But after the epidemic had ended, the pump handle was returned, and life went on. Investigations into the outbreak began, and most minds of the time went right back to thinking of things in terms of the miasma theory of disease. But a young curate who was the minister to the people of Broad Street and had sat with many of them during their final hours went further. This man, Henry Whitehead, began doing a serious investigation of his own to make sense of the whole thing. Deeply disturbed by why this had happened to his parish, he began writing monographs on his results and debunking the theories that so many had offered, especially about this outbreak being the result of the lax morals of the poor. One of the theories he thought he would debunk along the way was that silly notion Jon Snow had about the pump having something to do with the outbreak, but he never got around to it. Then, in November, a committee was formed to really look into the outbreak, and both Whitehead and Snow were invited to be on it. And here, Whitehead really began to test Snow's results. After all, sure, Snow had shown that people who had drunk from the pump suffered, but what of those who survived? If they had drunk from the pump and never gotten cholera, would that not put into question the water as a cause? And as a local prelate, Whitehead could do what Snow could not, reach out to all of those in the local area that hadn't fallen ill. His knowledge of the people of the area, and their intimate trust of him as their priest, actually allowed him to get the last pieces of data that Snow had needed. And as that data came in, his doubts about Snow's ideas began to melt away. But there was one final piece to the puzzle. Why now? The Broad Street pump had served the people well for years. It was groundwater, not water from one of the contaminated vendors, and when the city had studied it, they'd found no cracks that might have connected it to a sewage system. He was looking for a reason, flipping through the records at the office of the Registrar General, and that's when he found it. The index case. Patient 0. An infant, one who he remembered well, had died in the outbreak, but unlike most patients, this tiny child had, according to the records in the Registrar's office, held out for 4 days. That would put her case as predating the epidemic. Immediately, he went to the house of this child's mother, a woman who knew him well from the community. He asked about those days, and she talked about how she had tossed the child's diapers into a cesspool at the bottom of the house. The committee immediately authorized an examination of the cesspit and a new examination of the well. Sure enough, the cesspool was poorly built, and was seeping as much into the soil around it as into the sewer to which it was supposed to drain. 2 feet away through that soil lay the Broad Street well. With that final piece of data, they had all they needed. The committee would release its report, and that report would be dismissed or ignored by many at the time, but today, we know it as a report that changed the world. But perhaps...
Yeah, I think the video, the Mapman video, if you haven't seen my reaction to it, it's out there somewhere, but the original video is definitely worth watching. I think it's like the map that saved the most lives, or something like that.
Snow himself put it best. Talking to Whitehead, he said, "You and I may not live to see the day, and my name may be forgotten when it comes, but the time will arrive when great outbreaks of cholera will be things of the past, and it is knowledge of the way in which the disease is propagated which will cause them to disappear. And it is because of the tireless sleuthing of Jon Snow that that day is here. History has not forgotten you.
It's pretty
cool.
You
do know something, Jon Snow."
So that felt very much like a conclusion, because in a lot of ways it was, but there is the epilogue, and we are going to watch it. The sanitary movement. Here it is. So a Jon Snow epilogue. I don't know why this is not like a part 4. I guess because the other part is such a conclusion to like the Jon Snow story. This is the Jon Snow story, but this might be like more a legacy overview, which should be interesting. Okay, accidental manslaughter. I'll settle for that.
Jon Snow's report may not have done away with the miasma theory of disease, that would be left to Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, but it did surprisingly give contagionists and anti-contagionists one thing that they could agree on. Filth was bad. Whether you believed that fetid stenches from the cesspits caused the Broad Street outbreak, or whether you believed that contamination from those cesspits seeping into the water table were at its root, this sort of unregulated disposal of waste into streets, basements, and backyards was a problem. And so, Snow's report gave further credence to a growing movement.
A lot of Europeans, yeah, totally kidding. Totally kidding. I know she didn't mean to, and it's more of like a systematic problem of not being all that cleanly, which, you know, it's a good thing that sort of got fixed. I mean, like 90% of the time when I use a public bathroom, everybody else walks out with washing their hands, so I don't know if the world is fixed yet. But it's really interesting, like, the turn that this has. It's interesting that a lot of Europeans and European descendants, for a good amount of history, like, basically laugh at people from the East who are a little bit, who were, I believe the Chinese were, when they started immigrating to the United States, they were seen as a little strange for, like, how sanitary they tried to be, which that I found to be rather interesting, because it's like they're looking down on them for being clean, which is like the opposite of what you would expect somebody to do, based on like what we know about people's relationships with unwanted immigrants and stuff.
That played a huge part in defining and creating the
Not
modern
too dirty,
world,
too
but it's a
clean.
movement rarely discussed. So today we're going to talk about the sanitary movement. Now remember that everything we talked about with Jon Snow, everything we discussed with the Broad Street outbreak, happened in 1854. That's little more than 150 years ago, and yet to us today, it's unimaginable that you would let sewage just flow freely through the streets or pump filth into your drinking water. So how did that change occur? How, in
That's
just a
the
century and a
worst.
half, did we get from sewage-ridden cities to where we are today? Well, in my opinion, the impetus for the change was simple. This may sound mind-blowing, but until the 19th century, cities were demographically negative. More people died than were born in cities. They were only kept afloat due to a constant influx of people migrating in. And it makes sense. Squalid living conditions, tight-packed populations, and poor nutrition in a pre-refrigeration, pre-mass shipping world, these places were rife with disease. And for most of mankind's history, this wasn't a huge concern, as the vast majority of the population needed to be working the land just to produce the food society needed. But the Industrial Revolution changed all that. Improved farming techniques meant that fewer people had to be working the land, and the growth of finished goods economies, massive manufacturing economies, meant that people were needed in the cities to work the factories, and that meant that cities had to grow. You just can't have the complex, interconnected chains of production that define our world today unless you have great concentration of population and massive urban centers. This meant that we as a species had to rethink how we did cities, and the path to this began with a guy named Edwin Chadwick. In 1842, he
Hey.
released a report that basically said, look, guys, there's poop in the street. We gotta do something about the poop in the street. And surprisingly, this turned out to be a major catalyst
Poop is funny. It really is. Still, I'm almost 26. Poop is still funny.
for something actually being done about it. Now, there's a lot of debate over whether things started to get done because people actually cared about the plight of the poor, or if they were afraid of a popular uprising if conditions didn't get a little better, or if they actually just thought that more sanitary conditions meant fewer sick poor people, which meant that this was a way to make the poor cost the government less money. But no matter what the cause, things started to get done. And in fact,
It's very rarely purely humanitarian. When those in power step up and do the right thing, it's often a mixture of, hey, we can say we're being humanitarian, but we also have something else to gain from this. So it's probably a mixture.
the creation of local boards of health, like the very group that Jon Snow presented his findings to get the pump handle in Broad Street removed, were a direct result of some of the legislation precipitated by Chadwick's report. But in addition to forming local boards of health, this idea of creating sanitary cities went much further. They introduced sewers, real sewers, the kind we think of today. In fact, many of our major sewer systems today are the systems they built during this time. Although Jon Snow wouldn't live to see it, the London sewer system which his work helped to inspire, built in 1859, is still what our giant modern city of London uses today. And you know what?
Shoot. I gotta check out Jay Foreman's Unfinished London series. You guys keep reminding me to do that, and I keep forgetting to put it in the playlist. Next week, Unfinished London. Confirmed. It's gonna happen.
That horrible specter, that demon cholera that Jon Snow spent his entire life fighting, the sewer system vanquished it. London would see only one more cholera epidemic after the Broad Street outbreak that Jon Snow so valiantly tried to contain, and this final outbreak happened in the one part of London where the sewer system hadn't yet been completed. Luckily, this last epidemic was quickly attacked by a man named William Farr, the very same man who Jon Snow would so often pester at the Registrar General's office for statistics. He had learned from Snow and believed his theory, and he used Snow's methods to limit the outbreak of cholera in 1866.
That's
After
pretty dope.
that epidemic, cholera in London would be no more. And this may sound like a simple thing. I mean, we rarely ever think about the sewers flowing under our feet. But these sanitation projects were some of the greatest public works projects ever attempted. Monuments like the Eiffel Tower or Mount Rushmore pale in comparison to what needed to be done here. Imagine taking the city you live in and having to rip up every street, tunnel under every house, and connect every building with a massive network of pipes and waterways. Imagine the disruption this would cause.
I don't know
Imagine
how the world
expense.
works. I still can't wrap my mind around how like half of this stuff works.
I'm honestly not sure we would be bold enough to take on such projects today. The London system alone had to run 13,000 miles of pipe to see this project completed. That's roughly half the circumference of the Earth. They laid 318 million bricks and dug out 2.7 million cubic meters of dirt from the streets of London just to put this sewer system in. In Europe, major parts of cities were sometimes simply torn down and rebuilt whole cloth around more sanitary lines. In Chicago, they literally lifted the city up by 4 feet and put the sewer system underneath it. But in the end, these...
How'd they do that? I don't know anything about that. I need to know how they did that.
massive efforts had an effect. Not only was cholera defeated, but things like typhoid and typhus were massively reduced, paving the way for the giant economic engines that we think of as today's cities. It's largely unsung, rarely given pages in history books or called out in classes, but the sanitary movement is one of the bedrocks of modern civilization, one of the stepping stones to the world we understand today.
I think medical history and stuff like this, it's gonna blow up like crazy. It's gonna be super popular over this next generation with a bunch of people coming up and being interested in history during a literal pandemic. This is what people are going to be focusing on, like medical history. It's going to be huge. Like you see a massive output of books in that genre of history. While that's happening, the next generation of historians is coming up, and a lot of them are going to be focusing on stuff like this. I am certain of that.
It has had a profound effect on humanity and saved countless lives. It is up there with antibiotics and vaccines for the number of human deaths it's prevented. So today, we just wanted to look at this one piece of Jon Snow's legacy. He may only have been a tiny part of it, but it's a part I think he'd be proud of. And although he's better known as the father of epidemiology, and his contributions there were absolutely enormous, I think that he would want us to take a moment to look at and to remember a part of medical history that's so important but so often glossed over because it's unglamorous. So, unlike those who turned a blind eye to Snow's own discoveries because they found them unpleasant to think about, let's celebrate sanitation and all that it's done for us.
Sick.
Here's to you, Jon Snow.
Dude, we should celebrate sanitation. I'm gonna wash my hands right after this. But all jokes aside, that was actually a really cool thing, and I'm surprised I didn't check that out earlier. As far as like suggestions that I've gotten, it wasn't suggested a whole bunch, and that shocks me because it's kind of perfect for this time. I started putting out videos on this channel after I lost my job at the beginning of the pandemic. It seemed like the perfect time to check out stuff like this, and it took me this long, so isn't that crazy?